Shadow of Doubt. Chapter 1. The Accusation. Jack Marlowe was just an ordinary man leading a mundane life. He had a steady job, a small but comfortable apartment, and few but close friends. That all changed one crisp autumn evening when he returned home from work to find his front door ajar. His stomach tightened with unease as he pushed the door open, revealing the disarray within. Drawers were pulled out, their contents strewn across the floor. The television had been knocked off its stand, the coffee table overturned. It looked like a robbery, but something felt wrong. It wasn't the work of an amateur thief. It was too deliberate, too personal. He cautiously stepped inside, his eyes scanning the chaos. His mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened. There was no sign of forced entry, which meant whoever did this had a key or knew how to pick the lock. His thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of sirens in the distance, growing louder by the second. Panic gripped him. This wasn't just a robbery, it was a setup. But who would do this to him and why? Jack's heart pounded as he moved to the bedroom, where he found the most shocking discovery of all. Lying on his bed, motionless and lifeless, was the body of his neighbor, Claire Reynolds. Her wide, unseeing eyes stared up at the ceiling, her pale skin a stark contrast to the deep crimson pool spreading beneath her. Jack's mind went blank with horror. He staggered backward, his thoughts a tangled mess of fear and disbelief. He barely knew Claire, exchanged polite pleasantries in the hallway, and now she was dead in his bed. Before he could process what was happening, the front door burst open, and uniformed officers swarmed into the apartment. They quickly assessed the situation, their faces hardening as they took in the scene. Jack, standing frozen at the bedroom door, felt a surge of dread as they turned their accusatory gazes on him. "Jack Marlowe, you're under arrest for the murder of Claire Reynolds," one of the officers said, his voice cold and authoritative. He was pushed against the wall, his hands roughly yanked behind his back, cold steel snapping around his wrists. "But I didn't do anything," Jack protested, his voice trembling with panic. "I found her like this. You have to believe me." The officers didn't listen. Jack was hauled out of his apartment, the flashing lights of the police cars illuminating the darkened street outside. Neighbors gathered, whispering among themselves, their eyes wide with curiosity and suspicion. Jack was shoved into the back of a squad car, his mind spinning with a mix of fear and confusion. How had his life taken such a dark turn in a matter of minutes? As the car sped away, Jack realized he was now in a fight for his life. A fight to prove his innocence in a world that already believed him guilty. The shadow of doubt had been cast, and it threatened to consume him entirely. Chapter 2. The Interrogation. Hours later, Jack found himself in a small, dimly lit interrogation room. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow on the cold, metal table in front of him. His wrists were sore from the tight cuffs, now removed but leaving red marks on his skin. He tried to steady his breathing, to calm the racing thoughts that threatened to overwhelm him, but it was impossible. Everything was moving too fast and he was powerless to stop it. The door creaked open and two detectives entered the room. One was a tall, imposing man with a stern expression. The other, a woman with sharp eyes that seemed to pierce right through him. They both sat down across from Jack, their gazes fixed on him, scrutinizing every movement, every twitch of his face. "Jack Marlowe," the male detective began, his voice low and gravelly. "You're in a lot of trouble. Why don't you tell us what happened tonight?" Jack swallowed hard, trying to gather his thoughts. I came home from work and found my apartment ransacked. And then I found Claire dead. I don't know how she got there. I swear I didn't do anything." The female detective leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "You expect us to believe that you just happened to walk into your apartment and find a dead body on your bed? That's quite a coincidence, don't you think?" "I know how it sounds, but it's the truth," Jack insisted, his voice rising with desperation. "Someone set me up. Someone wanted me to take the fall for this." The male detective smirked, leaning back in his chair. "And who would want to do that? Do you have enemies we should know about? Someone with a grudge, maybe?" Jack shook his head, frustration bubbling up inside him. "No, I don't have enemies. I'm just an ordinary guy. I don't know why anyone would do this to me." The female detective tapped a folder that lay on the table. "We've already started gathering evidence, Jack. We know that Claire Reynolds was your neighbor. We know that you've been seen talking to her more than once. And we know that she was last seen entering your apartment earlier this evening. So what aren't you telling us?" Jack's heart sank. He hadn't realized how bad this looked, how damning the evidence seemed. But he had no explanation, no way to prove his innocence. His mind raced, trying to think of anything that could help his case, but he came up blank. "I didn't kill her," he said quietly, his voice trembling. "I don't know why she was in my apartment or who did this. But it wasn't me." The detectives exchanged glances, clearly unimpressed with his answer. The male detective stood up, gesturing to the door. "We'll be back. Maybe by then you'll remember something useful. Until then, you're not going anywhere." As the door slammed shut, Jack was left alone with his thoughts, the weight of his situation pressing down on him like a vice. The walls of the interrogation room seemed to close in, the shadows growing longer, darker. Jack realized that unless he could find a way to prove his innocence, those shadows would be the last thing he'd ever see. Chapter 3. The Escape. The hours dragged on in the stifling room. Jack's mind was a storm of fear and frustration, his thoughts looping back to the same haunting questions. Who would do this to him and why? He knew that as long as he stayed in that interrogation room, his chances of proving his innocence dwindled by the minute. He had to get out, had to find answers on his own. But how? A sudden commotion outside the room snapped Jack from his thoughts. He heard raised voices, the scuffle of feet, and then the door to his room swung open, revealing the two detectives. They looked tense, distracted. "Jack, stay here. Don't move," the male detective ordered, but his tone suggested that whatever was happening outside was more urgent than Jack's interrogation. As the detectives rushed out, leaving the door slightly ajar, Jack's pulse quickened. This was his chance. He had no plan, no idea where he would go, but staying put wasn't an option. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to escape before it was too late. He cautiously approached the door, peeking out into the corridor. The station was in disarray. Officers were rushing in every direction, their attention focused elsewhere. Whatever the emergency was, it had thrown the entire place into chaos. Jack's heart pounded as he slipped out of the room, moving quickly but carefully down the hall. The building's layout was unfamiliar, but Jack let adrenaline guide him, taking turns at random, trying to put as much distance between himself and the interrogation room as possible. He passed by the bullpen where a group of officers were gathered around a television screen, watching something with grim expressions. Jack didn't stop to see what it was. He couldn't afford to waste time. Finally, he spotted an emergency exit at the end of the hall. His breath caught in his throat as he pushed the door open, the night air hitting his face like a blast of freedom. He was outside, but he knew this was only the beginning. He couldn't go back to his apartment or anywhere familiar. They'd be looking for him everywhere. He needed a place to lay low, to figure out his next move. Jack ran down the alley behind the station, blending into the shadows. He kept moving, his mind racing with possibilities. He needed help, someone he could trust, but who? He thought of his friend Marcus, a tech-savvy guy who owed him a favor. If anyone could help him figure out who had set him up, it was Marcus. Jack made his way across town, avoiding well-lit areas, sticking to the back streets. By the time he reached Marcus's apartment, his lungs were burning and his nerves were frayed. He knocked on the door, hoping against hope that Marcus was home and would believe his story. After a tense moment, the door cracked open and Marcus's wary face appeared in the gap. "Jack, what the hell are you doing here, man? You're all over the news. They're saying you killed someone." Jack shoved his way inside, shutting the door behind him. "I didn't do it, Marcus. I was framed. I need your help. Please." Marcus hesitated, glancing at the television where a news anchor was recounting the story of Jack's supposed crime. Jack's mugshot flashed on the screen, along with the words, "Manhunt underway." "Jesus, Jack," Marcus muttered, rubbing a hand over his face. "You really didn't do it?" "I swear, Marcus, I'm innocent, but I can't prove it unless you help me. I need to find out who's behind this before they catch me." Marcus sighed, the weight of the situation settling heavily on him. "All right, but we have to move fast. They'll be looking for you everywhere." Jack nodded, relief flooding through him. He wasn't alone in this. With Marcus's help, he might have a chance to uncover the truth and clear his name. But time was running out, and the shadow of doubt loomed larger than ever. Chapter 4. The Revelation. Marcus's apartment was a cluttered haven of electronics, with wires and gadgets strewn across every surface. It was the perfect place for Jack to lay low while they figured out their next move. Marcus immediately got to work, pulling up his computer and hacking into the police database. "Okay, let's see what we can find," Marcus muttered, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "If you were set up, there's gotta be some trace of it somewhere." Jack hovered behind him, his nerves on edge. Every minute that passed felt like an eternity. The news had already started to spread, and soon the whole city would be on high alert, searching for him. He needed answers fast. After what felt like hours, Marcus suddenly froze, staring at the screen with wide eyes. "Jack, you need to see this." Jack leaned in, his heart pounding. Marcus had pulled up a series of emails, sent from an unknown address to someone named David Carver. The emails were cryptic, but the implications were clear. They discussed framing someone for a murder, making it look like an open and shut case, and planting evidence to ensure a conviction. "Who the hell is David Carver?" Jack asked, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. Marcus frowned, digging deeper into the database. "Looks like he's some kind of fixer. You know, the kind of guy who handles dirty work for people who want to keep their hands clean. But who hired him? That's the real question." Jack felt a cold dread settle in his gut. Someone had gone to great lengths to ruin his life, and now he had a name, a lead. But it wasn't enough. He needed to know who was pulling the strings, who wanted him out of the way badly enough to commit murder. "Can you trace the emails? Find out where they came from?" Jack asked, desperation creeping into his voice. Marcus nodded, his eyes narrowing in concentration. "I'll try, but it's not gonna be easy. These guys covered their tracks pretty well." As Marcus worked, Jack's mind raced. David Carver wasn't the mastermind, he was just the middleman. But if they could find out who was behind the emails, they might finally get some answers. They were getting closer, but the clock was ticking. Every second brought the police closer to finding him, and Jack knew that if they caught him before he could clear his name, it would be over. Finally, Marcus let out a triumphant noise. "Got it." The emails were sent from a private server linked to a corporation called Helios Dynamics. "Ever heard of them?" Jack shook his head, but the name sent a chill down his spine. "No, but I'm guessing they're not exactly a bunch of innocent bystanders." "Definitely not," Marcus agreed. "They're involved in all kinds of shady stuff, illegal arms deals, corporate espionage, you name it. If they're behind this, you're dealing with some very dangerous people, Jack." Jack's blood ran cold. He was in way over his head. Helios Dynamics was a multinational conglomerate with its fingers in all kinds of criminal pies. If they had decided to make him their scapegoat, they would stop at nothing to ensure he went down for the crime. "Why me?" Jack whispered, more to himself than to Marcus. "Why would they choose me?" Marcus glanced at him, his expression grim. "We need to find out. But first we need to get out of here. If Helios is involved, they'll have people looking for you too, not just the cops." Jack nodded, his resolve hardening. He wasn't going to let them destroy his life without a fight. Whoever was behind this, they had underestimated him. Jack Marlowe wasn't going down without a battle, and with Marcus by his side, he might just stand a chance. As they prepared to leave, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadow of doubt was growing darker, but now it had a name that could lead to the truth or to his ultimate demise. Chapter 5. The Pursuit. With the name Helios Dynamics echoing in his mind, Jack and Marcus quickly packed up what they could. They had to move fast before the net tightened around them. Marcus, ever the tech wizard, wiped his hard drives and secured any digital trails that might lead back to his apartment. Time was of the essence. As they slipped out into the night, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. His eyes darted around the dark streets, every shadow seeming to hide a threat. Marcus had a plan, a safe house on the outskirts of the city, a place where they could regroup and figure out their next move. But getting there would be the first test of their survival. They moved quickly, sticking to alleys and side streets, avoiding the main roads where the police and, potentially, Helios's hired guns would be patrolling. The city felt like a maze, every turn a gamble, every sound a potential sign of pursuit. Jack's nerves were frayed, his mind racing with scenarios of capture or worse. As they approached a deserted intersection, Marcus suddenly held up a hand, signaling for Jack to stop. "Wait," Marcus whispered, his eyes scanning the area. Jack followed his gaze and saw a black SUV idling at the corner, its engine running but lights off. The vehicle exuded an ominous presence, like a predator waiting to strike. "That's not the cops," Marcus murmured, his voice tense. "We need to go back. Now." But before they could retreat, the SUV's headlights snapped on, flooding the alley with blinding light. Jack's heart pounded as he grabbed Marcus's arm, pulling him into a sprint. The sound of screeching tires and revving engines followed them as they tore down the alley, desperate to escape. "Over here," Marcus shouted, veering towards a narrow passageway between two buildings. Jack followed, adrenaline surging through his veins. The SUV couldn't follow them through the tight space, but that didn't mean they were safe. Jack could hear the sound of doors slamming and footsteps pounding on pavement behind them. Their pursuers were on foot now, and they were gaining. "Keep moving," Marcus urged, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The passageway opened into a small courtyard, surrounded by towering brick walls. It was a dead end. Panic seized Jack as he realized they were trapped. Marcus frantically scanned the courtyard, his mind racing for an escape plan. "There," he pointed to a fire escape ladder partially pulled up just out of reach. "Boost me up." Without hesitation, Jack interlaced his fingers, creating a foothold for Marcus. With a grunt, Marcus leapt up, grabbing the bottom rung of the ladder. He pulled it down and Jack scrambled up after him, his heart pounding in his ears. They clambered up the fire escape as fast as they could, the sound of their pursuers growing louder with each passing second. Reaching the rooftop, Jack and Marcus didn't stop to catch their breath. They raced across the flat surface, jumping over ventilation ducts and skirting around antennas. Below them, they could hear the shouts of the men chasing them, but they didn't dare look back. "We have to get to the other side," Marcus shouted, pointing to a gap between their building and the next. The gap wasn't wide, but in their exhausted state, the jump seemed treacherous. With no other option, Jack took a running start and leapt across the void, landing hard on the rooftop of the next building. Marcus followed, barely making the jump. They both rolled to a stop, gasping for air. "We can't keep running like this," Jack panted, his chest heaving. "They'll catch us eventually." Marcus nodded, sweat dripping down his face. "We need to find out what Helios is hiding. If we can expose them, we might have a chance. But first, we need to lose these guys." They continued their rooftop dash, leaping from building to building, hoping to shake their pursuers. As they reached the edge of the city's industrial district, Marcus spotted a freight train slowly pulling out of a nearby rail yard. "Look, we can hitch a ride," Marcus suggested. "It'll take us out of the city, give us some breathing room." Without another word, they scrambled down the nearest fire escape and made a break for the train yard. The train was gaining speed, and they had only seconds to catch it. Jack ran with everything he had left, his legs burning with exhaustion. He grabbed onto a ladder on the side of one of the boxcars, pulling himself up just as the train began to leave the yard. Marcus followed close behind, and they both collapsed inside the boxcar, breathing heavily. The sound of the train's rhythmic clattering on the tracks filled the air, a strange lullaby in the tense silence that followed their escape. As the train carried them away from the city, Jack's thoughts turned to Helios Dynamics. They were no longer just a name on a screen, they were real, dangerous, and now they were after him. But he had something they didn't expect: determination, and with Marcus's help, the means to fight back. "Next stop, the truth," Jack muttered to himself, staring out at the dark countryside rushing past. He didn't know where the train would take them, but he knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Chapter 6. The Showdown. The train carried Jack and Marcus far from the city, through the night and into the early hours of the morning. By the time they finally disembarked, they found themselves in a small, sleepy town nestled in the hills. It was a far cry from the bustling city they had left behind, but it provided the cover they needed to regroup and plan their next move. They holed up in a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, where Marcus immediately set to work. His laptop, now their most crucial tool, became the center of their efforts. Jack paced the small room, his mind whirring with questions and fears. Helios Dynamics was a shadowy giant, and they were two men against a corporation with almost limitless resources. But they had one advantage: the element of surprise. Helios didn't know what they had discovered or what they were planning. That was their only edge, and Jack intended to use it to the fullest. "All right, I've got something," Marcus said, breaking the tense silence. "I hacked into Helios's private server. It wasn't easy, but I found a list of recent transactions. One of them stands out, a payment to David Carver labeled as special services." Jack leaned over Marcus's shoulder, staring at the screen. "That's it. That's the link we need." Carver was hired by Helios, but who inside the company ordered the hit? Marcus scrolled through the data, his eyes narrowing. "It looks like the payment was authorized by someone named Evelyn Drake. She's one of the senior executives at Helios. If anyone knows why you were targeted, it's her." "Evelyn Drake," Jack repeated, the name burning itself into his memory. "We need to get to her. If we can get her to talk, we might have a chance to clear my name." Marcus nodded, already formulating a plan. "We can't just waltz into Helios headquarters. But I can create a diversion, something that'll force her to come out of hiding. If we can get her alone, maybe we can make her talk." Jack's stomach twisted with anxiety. They were venturing into dangerous territory, but he had no choice. His life was on the line, and this was his only shot at clearing his name. "Let's do it." They spent the next few hours preparing. Marcus set up a series of fake data breaches, targeting key systems at Helios. The goal was to create enough chaos to draw Evelyn Drake out, to force her to deal with the situation personally. It was a risky gamble, but they had no other options. By the time they were ready, the sun had risen, casting a harsh light on the road ahead. Jack's heart raced as they made their way back towards the city, their plan in motion. The final confrontation was coming, and there was no turning back. They reached the city by midday and parked a few blocks away from Helios Dynamics' imposing headquarters. The building was a fortress of glass and steel, a symbol of the power they were up against. Jack's hands shook as he stared up at it, the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on him. "You ready for this?" Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the tension. Jack nodded, steeling himself. "Ready as I'll ever be." Marcus triggered the first part of their plan, a massive data breach that would send shockwaves through Helios's network. Within minutes, the building was a hive of activity, security teams scrambling to respond to the crisis. It was the perfect cover. Jack and Marcus moved quickly, blending in with the crowd of employees being evacuated from the building. They slipped inside, using Marcus's hacked keycard to access the executive floor. The plan was simple: find Evelyn Drake, confront her, and get the truth. As they navigated the labyrinth of corridors, Jack's nerves were stretched to the breaking point. Every step felt like a step closer to his fate, whether it was salvation or doom. Finally, they reached her office, a sleek, modern space at the heart of the building. The door was ajar, and inside they could see Evelyn Drake, a tall, stern woman with an air of authority. Jack's heart pounded as he stepped inside, Marcus close behind. Evelyn looked up, startled at their sudden appearance. Her eyes narrowed as she recognized Jack. "You," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "How did you get in here?" Jack didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I know you're behind this. You hired David Carver to frame me for murder. I want to know why." Evelyn's expression shifted from surprise to cold calculation. She stood slowly, her gaze locked on Jack. "You're in over your head, Mr. Marlowe. You have no idea who you're dealing with." "I'm dealing with someone who tried to destroy my life," Jack shot back, his voice shaking with anger. "But I'm not going down without a fight. Tell me why you did it. What did I do to deserve this?" Evelyn's lips curled into a smirk. "You were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. We needed a scapegoat, and you fit the bill perfectly. A nobody, easy to discredit, easy to dispose of." Jack felt a wave of cold fury wash over him. "I'm not nobody," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "and I'm not going to let you get away with this." But before he could say more, the door to the office burst open, and a group of armed security guards stormed in, their guns trained on Jack and Marcus. Evelyn's smirk widened as she watched the guards surround them. "You're finished, Mr. Marlowe," she said, her tone triumphant. "You should have stayed on the run. Now you've made it too easy." Jack's heart sank as the guards closed in. It felt like the end, but he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. He glanced at Marcus, who gave him a slight nod, a silent signal that they weren't out of moves just yet. In a blur of motion, Marcus dropped to the floor, pulling out a small device from his pocket and activating it. The lights in the office flickered, and the security systems went haywire. The guards hesitated, momentarily thrown off by the sudden malfunction. It was the opening Jack needed. He lunged at Evelyn, grabbing her by the arm and pulling her towards the door. Marcus followed, using the chaos to their advantage. They bolted down the hallway, dragging Evelyn with them as the guards struggled to regroup. As they reached the emergency stairwell, Jack shoved Evelyn inside, forcing her down the steps. "We're not done yet, Evelyn. You're going to tell the world what you did." Evelyn struggled, but Jack's grip was ironclad. They burst out of the stairwell into the underground parking garage, where Marcus had parked their getaway car. They shoved Evelyn into the back seat, and Marcus floored the gas, speeding out of the garage just as the alarms blared behind them. The car careened through the city streets, Jack's mind racing with adrenaline. They had Evelyn Drake, the key to everything. Now, all they had to do was stay one step ahead of Helios and the authorities long enough to make her confess. But as the city blurred by, Jack knew this was only the beginning. They were still in the shadow of doubt, still fighting against a powerful enemy. But now, for the first time, they had the upper hand. And Jack wasn't going to let it slip away.